What would you do if, in front of a crowd, someone stripped you of your dignity with a single gesture? Not because you were wrong, not because you broke a rule, but simply because of how you looked. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Naomi Ellington at the gate of a first-class flight. She was slapped and humiliated by a flight attendant who decided she didn't belong. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Naomi wasn't just a passenger. She was the CEO of the very airline where this injustice took place. Now imagine yourself in her place, with power in your hands and anger in your heart. What would you choose? Would you strike back and punish? Or would you turn humiliation into a lesson that could change thousands of lives? This story is not only about prejudice, it's about courage, silence, and the choices that define who we are. And as you listen, I promise you'll find yourself asking, if it were me, how would I respond? Stay tuned. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this is more than a story. It's a mirror. The terminal at Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday afternoon. Rolling suitcases clicked against polished tiles. Voices blended into a restless hum, and the loudspeakers spilled one boarding announcement after another. People hurried. Families argued about gate numbers. Business travelers hunched over laptops, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from the concession stands. But then it happened. A sound like a gunshot sliced through the noise, a sharp crack, loud enough to halt conversations mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. Silence rippled outward across the crowded boarding gate like a wave. An elegant cane clattered to the floor, ivory handle bouncing once before sliding a few feet away. An elderly black woman, tall yet slightly stooped, lifted a trembling hand to her cheek. Her blue-gray eyes widened, not in fear, but in disbelief. Standing rigid before her was a flight attendant in crisp navy uniform, her name tag glinting under fluorescent light, Charlotte Briggs. Her hand still hovered mid-air from the strike. Her jaw was tight, eyes blazing with a mixture of irritation and authority. "I told you to step aside," she snapped, her voice carrying across the gate. "First-class boarding isn't for people like you." The crowd gasped collectively. Some passengers flinched as if they too had been slapped. Yet no one stepped forward. People shifted, whispered, exchanged uncomfortable looks, but feet remained rooted to the ground. The woman Charlotte had struck, Dr. Naomi Ellington, steadied herself. She bent slowly, deliberately, to retrieve her cane. The movement carried both dignity and defiance. Straightening, she gripped the polished handle firmly and fixed her gaze on the attendant. Her expression was calm, too calm. Her voice was quiet, yet somehow it reached every ear in the terminal. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your career." A shiver passed through the crowd. Only moments before, Naomi had been waiting patiently in the lounge nearby. She wore a forest green dress, understated yet refined, with a silk scarf draped loosely around her shoulders. Her silver-streaked hair was styled in soft waves. Many had walked past without a second glance, assuming she was simply another elderly woman making her way home. She had noticed how Charlotte Briggs had scanned the boarding line earlier, eyes darting quickly, ranking passengers like merchandise. Expensive suits acknowledged, designer luggage welcomed, authority and posture respected. But Naomi Ellington, her cane, her age, her modest style, dismissed in an instant. Naomi had felt that gaze before, in boardrooms, in country clubs, even in hospital corridors during her early career. It was the look that judged her as less than before a single word had been spoken. At the gate, Charlotte barely glanced at Naomi's boarding pass before blocking her with an arm. "Ma'am, this line is for first-class passengers only," she said, crisp but condescending. "I'm aware," Naomi answered evenly. Charlotte frowned, inspecting the ticket more closely. Her lips curled slightly, disbelief written across her face. "Are you certain this is yours? Perhaps there's been a mistake." The tone was the same one used with confused children or lost tourists. "Yes," Naomi replied. Her voice did not waver. "I'm certain." Passengers behind them exchanged nervous looks. A young woman shifted from foot to foot, biting her lip. A man in a tailored suit, Marcus Caldwell, watched with rising unease. He considered speaking up, then stayed silent. Charlotte exhaled loudly, glancing over Naomi's shoulder as though expecting a caretaker to step in. But no one moved. Naomi was alone. "I think you're confused," Charlotte continued, her voice louder now, as if performing for the watching crowd. She gestured toward the economy gate. "You belong over there." Naomi didn't move. "There is no mistake," she said firmly. "This is my seat." Charlotte's eyes flashed with irritation. "I've had enough," she muttered. She snatched the boarding pass from Naomi's hand, holding it against the light as if hunting for forgery. Her lip curled in contempt. "I don't know how you got this, but you're not sitting here today." Naomi remained still. She had faced sharper words in her lifetime. She had endured greater humiliations and still risen above them. But then, Charlotte snapped. With a sudden motion, she slapped the boarding pass from Naomi's hand. The ticket fluttered to the floor. The cane slipped from Naomi's grasp and hit the tile with a resounding echo. The silence that followed was suffocating. Naomi bent once again, slowly, to retrieve her cane. Every movement was deliberate, graceful. When she rose to her full height, she looked directly into Charlotte's eyes. The crowd held its breath. "You've just made," Naomi repeated, voice calm but heavy with unspoken weight, "the gravest mistake of your life." Charlotte forced out a scoff, but her eyes flickered uneasily. "Ma'am, I don't have time for theatrics. If you refuse to move, I'll have security escort you out immediately." The murmurs around them grew louder. The atmosphere at the gate had shifted from curiosity to outrage, though still no one intervened. And yet, in that silence, one truth had begun to emerge. This was no ordinary passenger, and Charlotte Briggs had no idea whom she had just humiliated. For a few suspended seconds, the boarding gate was frozen in silence. The harsh echo of the cane striking the floor still lingered in the air, as if the tiles themselves remembered the insult. All around, passengers held their breath, waiting, caught between outrage and hesitation. Charlotte Briggs straightened her uniform jacket and tightened her jaw, pretending not to feel the dozens of eyes now fixed on her. Her hand trembled slightly, though she tried to disguise it by smoothing her skirt. A hot pulse of adrenaline surged through her. She had overstepped, yes, but retreat was impossible now. To back down in front of this crowd would feel like weakness. She doubled down. "Security will be here shortly," she said coldly, her voice pitched to project authority. "This is first-class boarding. We have standards to uphold." The murmur of whispers grew louder. A mother pulled her young son a step closer, shielding him as though the air itself was dangerous. A man in a business suit muttered under his breath, but said nothing more. People shifted uncomfortably, none daring to intervene. Naomi Ellington's face was unreadable. She did not lash out, did not cry. Her calm was more unnerving than any outburst could have been. With slow composure, She lifted her boarding pass from the floor and dusted it lightly, as though even paper deserved dignity. Then she placed her cane firmly in front of her, steadying herself. When she spoke, her tone was low, but every syllable carried. "You've humiliated me in front of strangers for no reason but your own assumption." Charlotte bristled. "I don't need a lecture, ma'am. My responsibility is to make sure first class remains first class. We can't allow—" She stopped short, catching herself. The words had slipped too close to revealing her real bias. Naomi raised an eyebrow, just slightly, but it cut sharper than a blade. Allow what she asked. The crowd shifted again. It was the question everyone else had heard hidden inside Charlotte's words. Charlotte glanced toward her colleague, Alyssa Grant, who stood a few feet away. The younger attendant's face was pale. Alyssa's eyes darted between Naomi and Charlotte, uncertainty written in every line. Her lips parted once, as though she might say something, but she quickly pressed them together. "Call security. Alyssa." Charlotte barked. Alyssa hesitated, her hand hovering over the intercom. Something deep in her gut told her this was wrong beyond protocol, wrong beyond professionalism, but Charlotte's glare cut like steel. Alyssa lowered her eyes and slowly reached for the handset. At that very moment, Marcus Caldwell, the suited businessman who had been watching in mounting discomfort, clenched his jaw. His conscience wavered. He was no stranger to seeing people treated unfairly in public spaces. He had walked away before, but watching the elderly woman stand so calm, so dignified, even after being struck, churned something in him. He half rose from his seat, then faltered. Speaking out against staff could create a scene, could delay his flight, could complicate his carefully planned schedule. And so, shamefully, he sat back down. The silence at the gate grew heavier, punctuated only by the nervous coughs and shifting of feet. Charlotte squared her shoulders, preparing to finish what she had started. "Ma'am," she said, her tone icy, "you have exactly two options: step aside quietly, or be escorted out by airport security. Which will it be?" Naomi's eyes softened, almost with pity. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and took one calm step closer. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, as though gravity pulled them to her words. "I will board this flight," Naomi said, steady and firm, "and I will sit in the seat that belongs to me. If you choose to escalate this further, the consequences will not fall on me." The calm certainty in her voice unnerved even Charlotte. It was not defiance. It was assurance. Charlotte's chest rose and fell quickly. She could feel her control of the crowd slipping like sand through her fingers. The passengers' stares burned hotter by the second. She needed to reassert dominance, to reestablish authority. Her eyes flicked to the security office down the hall, but no help had yet arrived. So she leaned in close. Lowering her voice to a hiss meant only for Naomi. "Whatever seat you think is yours, I promise you, you'll never make it there." Naomi did not flinch. "You've already guaranteed I will," she replied, her eyes unwavering. Charlotte jerked back as though she'd touched an electric wire. The murmurs rose now. Less whispers, more voices daring to question. That was out of line. "She has a ticket, doesn't she? This is going too far." The tide of public opinion had shifted, and Charlotte felt it pressing against her like a wall of water. Alyssa's hand still hovered over the intercom, her knuckles white. "Finally," she whispered, almost pleading. "Charlotte, maybe we should double-check the system." Charlotte spun toward her, eyes blazing. "Do it," she snapped. Alyssa froze, torn between obedience and conscience. And then, before she could act, A new voice cut through the tension, measured, calm and authoritative. That won't be necessary. Every head turned toward the sound. A man in a tailored charcoal suit strode confidently down the terminal, a badge clipped to his lapel. His presence radiated control, his expression unreadable but commanding. He did not glance at Charlotte. His eyes went straight to Naomi, and his pace quickened with respect. The murmurs swelled. Recognition flashed across some faces. "Is that Edward Monroe?" a passenger whispered. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Monroe was no ordinary manager. He was the airline's director of operations, a man rarely seen on the ground, let alone at a boarding gate. His sudden arrival shifted the entire atmosphere like a storm front rolling in. Naomi inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, as though she had expected him. Monroe stopped before her, his voice carrying enough weight to silence the crowd entirely. "Dr. Ellington," he said, with a tone lined with deference, "on behalf of our entire airline, please accept my sincerest apologies for this disgraceful treatment. Your seat is ready, and we are honored to have you aboard." Charlotte felt her knees weaken. The color drained from her face. Dr. Ellington. The name echoed in her mind like a bell tolling her doom. Passengers exchanged stunned looks, whispers growing louder. Alyssa's eyes widened. Marcus Caldwell sat up straighter, finally realizing the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Charlotte stammered, her voice breaking. "Wait, what's She's only now." Did Edward Monroe turn his gaze upon her? His eyes were ice, his voice lethal in its calm. "Step aside immediately. Miss Briggs." The terminal was silent once more, but the silence was no longer one of hesitation. It was judgment. Charlotte stepped back mechanically, her chest heaving, her throat constricting around words she could not find. And Naomi Ellington, cane tapping softly against the tile, walked forward with unhurried grace, the path before her clearing like water before a ship. Every eye followed her. Charlotte's world, once so firmly under her control, had just crumbled in the span of a single minute. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of her reckoning. The boarding gate had never felt so suffocating. After Edward Monroe's words, the terminal seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The hum of the airport still surrounded them, distant boarding calls, rolling luggage, the faint hiss of the air vents, but near gate C-17 silence ruled. Passengers who had witnessed everything kept their eyes locked on the scene, unable to look away. Some leaned forward, others covered their mouths in disbelief. But all were united in a single truth. Something irreversible had just happened. Naomi Ellington stood composed, her cane steady beneath her hand, her posture radiating calm authority. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't so much as shift her expression. Her dignity alone made the silence heavier. Charlotte Briggs, however, was unraveling. She felt the crowd's judgment pierce her skin like tiny needles. Every glance was an accusation, every whisper a sentence. Her mouth had gone dry, and her palms were damp despite the icy chill of dread creeping through her chest. Edward Monroe's stern voice still rang in her ears. "Step aside immediately." She had obeyed, but now she lingered at the edge of the boarding lane, exposed, with nowhere to retreat. Alyssa Grant stood frozen a few feet away, still clutching the intercom phone she had nearly used to summon security. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. She wanted to step forward, to do something, anything, to make up for her silence earlier. Yet her training screamed at her to remain neutral, professional, unseen. She lowered the phone slowly, setting it back in place, as though afraid even the small click would echo too loudly. Naomi adjusted her scarf and turned slightly toward the gathered passengers. Her gaze swept the crowd, not sharp, not condemning, but searching, seeking recognition of the truth they had all just witnessed. Many looked down quickly, unable to meet her eyes. Some shifted uncomfortably, ashamed of their own passivity. The tension thickened further when Marcus Caldwell finally rose from his seat. His tall frame and tailored suit should have commanded confidence, but his face carried guilt. He cleared his throat once, awkwardly, drawing attention he hadn't intended. Naomi's eyes landed on him, calm, expectant. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He had been a witness from the beginning. He had considered speaking, but stayed silent, rationalizing it away with excuses not his fight, not his place, not worth the disruption. Now the shame of that decision weighed on him heavier than his leather briefcase ever could. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat again. I saw everything. She had the ticket. She was treated unfairly. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't heroic. But it broke the silence. A ripple of murmurs passed through the passengers. Some nodded quietly. A woman whispered to her husband. At least someone finally said it. Another man muttered, "About time." Charlotte's stomach twisted violently. Her once loyal silence from the crowd had turned into subtle condemnation. Her authority, which she'd always worn like a crown, now lay shattered on the tile floor with the echoes of Naomi's cane. Edward Monroe gestured toward the jet bridge. "Dr. Ellington, please allow us to escort you to your seat." Naomi inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe, but I am capable of walking on my own." Her cane tapped softly as she began moving forward, step by deliberate step. Each tap echoed like a metronome, measuring the heavy silence of those who watched her pass. Passengers instinctively shifted aside, creating a clear path, as though in silent acknowledgement of her rightful place. Charlotte's throat constricted painfully. Every instinct screamed for her to fade into the background, to escape the burning gazes, but she couldn't move. She was pinned in place, shackled by her own choices. Alyssa's eyes followed Naomi closely. The older woman's calm radiated something she couldn't explain, a quiet power that seemed to demand respect without a single raised word. It made Alyssa's chest ache with regret. She could still hear the harshness in Charlotte's voice, see the humiliation in Naomi's eyes when the ticket was slapped from her hand. And she had done nothing. As Naomi reached the jet bridge, she paused, turning her head slightly to glance back, not at Charlotte directly, but at the entire crowd. Her eyes lingered just long enough to leave an impression, a silent reminder etched into memory. Then she continued forward, vanishing slowly into the bright light of the boarding tunnel. The silence that remained was unbearable. Charlotte felt her knees buckle slightly. She braced herself against the podium, her knuckles white, as passengers continued whispering around her. Her ears burned with fragments of their words. Disgraceful. Unbelievable. She hit her? CEO. Marcus Caldwell shook his head, adjusting his tie nervously. For the first time, he approached Charlotte directly. "You realize," he said quietly, his voice steady but laced with disappointment, "that everyone here will remember what they saw for the rest of their lives." Charlotte's lips parted, but no words emerged. Edward Monroe cut in, his voice sharp but calm. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you for your statement. Please proceed to board when ready." Marcus hesitated, then nodded stiffly and moved toward the jet bridge, his shoulders still tense with unspoken conflict. Charlotte turned toward Edward, desperation creeping into her voice. "Mr. Monroe, please, this was a misunderstanding." She didn't look like Monroe's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Finish that sentence carefully, Miss Briggs." The words died in her throat. Monroe leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You will answer for this. Not here. Not now, but very soon. Until then, you will conduct yourself with the professionalism this uniform demands. Do you understand?" Charlotte swallowed hard, her head jerking in a shaky nod. Satisfied. Monroe turned and followed Naomi toward the plane. His departure left Charlotte exposed once again to the harsh glow of fluorescent lights and the heavier glow of judgment from every side. Alyssa finally moved closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Charlotte, maybe you should sit this one out. Let me take over boarding." Charlotte snapped her head toward the younger attendant, fury flashing across her features. "I don't need your pity, Alyssa." But her voice lacked conviction. It cracked on the final word, betraying the fear curling like ice in her stomach. Alyssa flinched slightly, then stepped back. She said nothing more, but her eyes lingered on Charlotte with a mixture of pity and something sharper, quiet disapproval. Passengers resumed boarding slowly, their conversations hushed but intense. Some stared openly at Charlotte, others avoided her gaze entirely, but no one treated her as they once had. Respect had drained away, replaced by a quiet, damning awareness. Charlotte clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She wanted desperately to scream, to insist she had only been protecting first class, to claim she'd been misunderstood, but deep inside, buried beneath layers of denial, she knew the truth. She had seen Naomi Ellington and assumed she didn't belong. And in that assumption, she had revealed more about herself than she ever intended. The silence would not let her forget. Inside the jet bridge, the sounds of the terminal faded into a muffled hum. The air was cooler here, tinged with the metallic scent of recycled ventilation. Naomi Ellington's cane tapped softly as she moved forward, unhurried, every step purposeful. Edward Monroe walked half a pace behind, his presence protective. But Naomi did not lean on him. She carried herself with the same quiet strength she had honed over decades in boardrooms, hospitals, and auditoriums. Her mind, however, was anything but still. The sting on her cheek from Charlotte's hand was faint now, but the memory of it burned deeper. Not the slap itself that was fleeting, but the look in Charlotte's eyes when she delivered it. Dismissal, contempt, as if Naomi's very presence in a first-class line was an intrusion, a mistake to be corrected. Naomi had seen that look before. The memories rose unbidden, as they always did when life reminded her of the boundaries people tried to draw around her existence. She was 16 again, standing in the hall of her high school in Georgia, listening to a teacher tell her that her college dreams were too ambitious for someone like you. She was 24, fresh out of medical school, when an older colleague laughed openly at her for suggesting she might specialize in neurosurgery. She was 38, walking into a boardroom where every seat was filled with white men in suits, and feeling the chill of doubt brush her shoulders before she even opened her mouth. And yet, in each of those moments, she had chosen calm. She had chosen patience. Not because she was weak, but because she understood that fury alone could not build bridges, could not dismantle systems. Every time someone tried to belittle her, she answered not with rage, but with achievement, with persistence, with grace that outlasted their ignorance. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Gravelly but steady, Naomi, storms will test your strength. But remember, an oak does not shout to prove it is strong. It simply stands. She had carried those words with her into every battle. And tonight, as she walked steadily toward her seat on Flight 227, she carried them still. Monroe cleared his throat gently. Dr. Ellington, He hesitated, then softened his tone. I assure you, this will be dealt with swiftly. Miss Briggs will face consequences for her actions. Naomi paused, turning to meet his gaze. Her eyes, though calm, carried a depth that made Monroe shift uncomfortably. Consequences are inevitable, she said, but punishment alone doesn't erase the stain. What matters is whether she learns why she was wrong, not just that she was caught. Monroe nodded, though his expression remained tense. He admired Naomi, respected her leadership, but even now he marveled at how she remained centered when others might have demanded immediate retribution. They reached the aircraft door. The interior of the plane glowed warmly, the scent of leather and faint perfume greeting them. Passengers in first class looked up curiously as Naomi entered, their gazes bouncing from her cane to Monroe's deferential posture, piecing together the story with silent astonishment. Naomi walked to her seat, 1A, and lowered herself gracefully. She placed her cane beside her, adjusted her scarf, and folded her hands in her lap. To the untrained eye, she looked perfectly composed, but inside her thoughts churned. She thought of the passengers at the gate, their silence, their hesitation, their fear of involvement. She could not condemn them entirely. Silence was often easier, safer, but she wondered how many of them would replay the scene tonight, lying in bed, realizing they had witnessed injustice and done nothing. Perhaps that guilt would become a seed, pushing them to speak up the next time. Perhaps. Across the cabin, Marcus Caldwell entered, his step slower than usual. He glanced at Naomi, his face shadowed with shame. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of his earlier cowardice. Naomi returned a faint nod of her own, neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply recognition. As boarding continued, Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the cabin fill her senses. The chatter of flight attendants, the thud of luggage in overhead bins, the ding of seatbelt reminders. For anyone else, this was an ordinary flight. But Naomi knew this evening would not remain ordinary. Charlotte's slap was not just an isolated act of disrespect. It was a mirror reflecting something larger. Something systemic. She exhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. There was a decision ahead of her, how she would respond, what message she would allow this incident to carry. Retaliation could satisfy anger, but change required something more. She had always believed her role, her calling, was bigger than herself. When she opened her eyes, the decision was already forming in her mind. In the galley at the front, Charlotte Briggs stood rigid, her back pressed against the counter, sweat beading at her hairline. She could barely process what had happened. She had struck a passenger, an unforgivable breach in itself. Worse, that passenger was the CEO. Her career teetered on the edge of ruin. But what rattled her most was the memory of Naomi's eyes, calm, unwavering, not fearful, but knowing. Charlotte felt exposed, as though Naomi had seen straight through her excuses, straight into the part of her that had judged without mercy. Alyssa approached cautiously, handing her a stack of service papers. Her voice was quiet but steady. Charlotte, maybe you should take a step back tonight. I can handle the cabin. Charlotte snapped her head up, ready to lash out, but the words died on her tongue. Alyssa's eyes were not mocking, not triumphant. They were sad, disappointed. Charlotte looked away, her throat tight. She muttered, "I'll be fine." But she wasn't. Naomi, seated in 1A, could sense the tension even without looking. She had no desire to humiliate Charlotte further in front of passengers, but she knew the confrontation was far from over. Tonight would bring more questions, more reckonings. For now. She rested her hand lightly on her cane, her father's words echoing again. The oak does not shout. It stands, and stand she would. Marcus Caldwell settled into his seat in 2C, but comfort was impossible. The leather cushion beneath him felt cold. His tie itched at his neck, and every sound in the cabin seemed louder than it should be. He placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him, but his hands lingered on the handle, clenching and unclenching. He had seen everything. From the moment Dr. Naomi Ellington had stepped into the boarding line until the moment Edward Monroe appeared like a storm. Marcus replayed it in his mind with the clarity of a man cursed with perfect memory. He had watched an injustice unfold, one so blatant it made his stomach churn, and he had chosen silence until it was nearly too late. The guilt pressed down on him like a weight. For years, Marcus had prided himself on being practical, efficient, a man who didn't get entangled in drama that wasn't his responsibility. His life was ruled by schedules, investments, and meetings that ran on time. But what had that practicality given him now? He had sat idle while a woman, an elderly woman, was humiliated before his eyes. It didn't matter that he had spoken up later. The truth was that when the moment first demanded courage, he had faltered. His thoughts wandered back to his own childhood. He had grown up in Chicago's South Side, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who preached responsibility but often failed to live it. Marcus had been taught early on that silence was safer than resistance. When neighborhood fights broke out, he was the boy who crossed the street instead of stepping in. When teachers picked on classmates, he kept his head down, unwilling to share their fate. That instinct to protect himself had never left. Now, staring across the aisle at Naomi Ellington sitting calmly in 1A, he felt the weight of those instincts like chains. She radiated composure, but he knew she carried more scars than she revealed. He wondered if she had noticed his hesitation, if she had marked him as just another bystander, too afraid to speak until safety was guaranteed. Marcus exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. The truth stung, she had noticed. Of course she had. Her faint nod earlier was not absolution, not even acknowledgement. It was a mirror, showing him what he already knew about himself. The engines outside roared as boarding finished. The steady stream of passengers slowed, the aisle cleared, and the cabin door closed with a decisive click. Flight attendants hurried through safety checks. Charlotte Briggs avoided eye contact with everyone, her face rigid, while Alyssa Grant moved quietly, offering drinks and adjusting overhead bins. Marcus leaned back, eyes drifting shut, but closing them only sharpened the images in his head. Naomi's cane clattering to the floor, Charlotte's hand raised in arrogance. The silence of dozens of witnesses, including him. He hated the silence most of all. The plane began to taxi, the subtle vibration thrumming through the floor. Marcus felt his phone buzz in his pocket and pulled it out. A text from his assistant blinked on the screenboard. Call moved to 10 a.m. tomorrow. Safe travels. Sir? He stared at the words for a long moment. Safe travels. The phrase mocked him. How safe had Naomi felt at that gate, surrounded by strangers who chose not to act? He turned the phone over in his hand, then slipped it back into his jacket. He couldn't escape the unease growing inside him. It wasn't just guilt, it was recognition. He was successful now, respected, treated well because of the wealth he had accumulated and the polished way he presented himself. But he knew what it meant to be underestimated. to be pushed aside when people assumed you didn't belong. He remembered being a young man at his first corporate job, walking into a boardroom where he was the only black employee, listening as executives addressed everyone but him. He remembered forcing himself to smile through the discomfort, telling himself it wasn't worth making a scene. He remembered promising, quietly, that one day he would earn enough power to silence their doubts. And yet here he was, decades later, wealthy and accomplished, still shrinking into silence at the first sign of confrontation. Marcus opened his eyes and looked again at Naomi. She sat with her hands folded neatly, gaze out the window. Her profile was steady, strong, unshaken. He wondered what she thought of him. Did she see a coward? Did she see a man too comfortable and privileged to risk it by speaking out? He rubbed his temple. Perhaps he was both. The plane lifted off, engines roaring, the city lights falling away beneath them. Passengers settled into their routines, opening magazines, reclining seats, ordering drinks, but Marcus couldn't settle. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a notebook, the kind he used for planning quarterly goals. His pen hovered over the page. At first, he meant to draft notes for tomorrow's meeting, but instead, words spilled onto the paper. I stayed silent. She stood alone. I cannot let that happen again. The sentence sat stark and raw in the middle of the page. He underlined it once, then closed the notebook. Alyssa appeared at his side, offering water. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the glass down. Marcus looked up at her, and for a moment, he saw the same conflict in her eyes that he carried in his heart. "You saw it too," he said quietly. Alyssa froze. Her lips parted as if to deny it, but then she closed them, nodded faintly, and moved on down the aisle. Marcus took a sip of the water, cool against his dry throat. The guilt didn't fade, but something else began to stir beneath it. Resolve. Maybe it wasn't too late to change the story. Not for Naomi, not for Charlotte, but for himself. He knew one thing for certain: the next time silence pressed down like a weight, he would not stay seated. And as he leaned back in his chair, he realized this flight was not just carrying him to San Francisco, it was carrying him to a reckoning with himself. The plane leveled off smoothly, the seatbelt sign dimming with a quiet chime. Conversation in the first-class cabin rose again, but the undercurrent was tense, a current that refused to settle. A few passengers flipped open laptops, others ordered drinks, but every so often their eyes drifted back toward seat 1A, where Dr. Naomi Ellington sat with her scarf tucked neatly, her cane leaning against the armrest, her composure unbroken. Edward Monroe rose from his seat in row 3. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed a hand over his tie, and began moving slowly toward the front. Every movement seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. Passengers noticed. Some straightened, others lowered their voices. His presence was a reminder that what had happened at the gate had not been forgotten, nor would it be ignored. Charlotte Briggs, stationed in the galley, stiffened the moment she saw him approach. The edges of her confidence had already frayed. Now, under Monroe's calm but commanding gaze, she felt them unravel completely. She had survived the boarding fiasco only by clinging to routine tasks, checking manifests, pouring coffee, but she knew this moment was coming. Monroe stopped just short of her, his eyes fixed, voice low enough to keep the conversation private, but sharp enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. "Miss Briggs," he said, "we need to speak." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Mr. Monroe, I can explain. This is not the place for explanations. Monroe interrupted. "This is the place for accountability. You will remain professional for the remainder of this flight. Afterward, you will face a formal inquiry. Do you understand?" Charlotte's mouth went dry. She nodded, words failing her. "Satisfied." Monroe shifted his attention past her, toward Naomi. He stepped into the aisle and inclined his head respectfully. "Dr. Ellington." "May I?" Naomi gestured lightly to the empty seat beside her. Monroe sat, folding his hands on his lap. For a moment, the two simply sat in silence, the hum of the engine surrounding them. Finally, Monroe spoke. "On behalf of this airline, I owe you not only an apology, but a commitment. What you endured tonight was unacceptable. I want you to know that it will not be brushed aside." Naomi studied him carefully. His words carried weight, but she was a woman who had lived long enough to know that apologies and promises were easy currency. What mattered was whether actions followed. "I appreciate your presence," she said softly, "but I don't need assurances for myself. I need them for every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong." Monroe's jaw tightened. He had seen discrimination before, of course, but rarely so blatant and never against someone of Naomi's stature. Yet her words cut deeper. It wasn't about her title, or her wealth, or her power. It was about the principle. "I understand," he replied, "and I will ensure the board understands as well. This incident will shape more than one career." Naomi's gaze softened slightly. "Careers can change. People can, too, but only if they're given the chance to see themselves clearly." Monroe followed her eyes toward the galley. Charlotte was still there, pretending to review paperwork, but failing to mask the stiffness in her shoulders. "She will see herself clearly soon," Monroe murmured. Naomi nodded, then leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. Her calm returned, like the steady rhythm of her cane tapping against the tile earlier. But even in her calm, she carried the weight of choice, how she would respond, how she would direct this moment toward something larger than retribution. Across the aisle, Marcus Caldwell watched the exchange. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the respect Monroe gave Naomi, the way she received it with quiet strength rather than triumph. His guilt twisted again, but with it came something else, admiration. She wasn't just powerful, she was purposeful. Alyssa passed through the aisle, offering drinks. She paused subtly near Naomi's row, lowering her voice. "Would you care for tea, Dr. Ellington?" Naomi opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Chamomile, if you have it." Alyssa nodded quickly. "Of course." It was a small gesture, a simple courtesy. But Naomi recognized the shift. Alyssa was trying, in her own way, to correct the silence she had maintained earlier. Naomi accepted it without judgment, understanding that courage grew in increments. When Alyssa left, Monroe leaned closer. His voice softened. "Dr. Ellington, if I may ask, how do you remain so calm?" After everything, Naomi's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Because anger, though justified, is fleeting. Change requires something that lasts longer." Monroe studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps tonight will be the beginning of change." The hum of the engines deepened as the plane continued westward, lights of cities glimmering far below. Passengers settled into sleep or screens, unaware that in the first-class cabin, decisions were forming that would ripple far beyond a single flight. Charlotte lingered in the galley, her chest tight, her thoughts racing. She had expected punishment, maybe suspension, maybe worse. But what unsettled her most was not Monroe's authority. It was Naomi's composure. That quiet strength gnawed at her, forced her to reflect on the ugliness of her own actions. She wanted to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her like shadows, and deep inside, though she wouldn't admit it aloud, Charlotte Briggs began to fear not just losing her job, but losing the version of herself she had pretended to be. Dinner service had begun in first class, silver trays sliding out from the galley, the aroma of seared steak and garlic butter filling the air. Yet no one could quite shake the unease. Whispers passed between passengers. Cautious glances returned again and again to Naomi Ellington. Some had pieced together fragments of who she might be. Others only sensed that she was more than she appeared. Naomi herself sat quietly, her hands resting over the carved handle of her cane, watching the cabin with calm awareness. She had no interest in caviar or fine wine. Her presence alone was statement enough. But the moment of revelation was coming, and she knew it would not come from her lips. It began subtly. Marcus Caldwell leaned slightly across the aisle, lowering his voice just enough for the nearby passengers to overhear. "Forgive me for asking, ma'am," he said carefully, "but are you Dr. Ellington, the Naomi Ellington?" The air shifted instantly, heads turned. Even Charlotte Briggs froze in place, tray in hand, her heart pounding as if the words were daggers aimed at her. Naomi's eyes met Marcus's. She did not answer right away, letting silence fill the space. She could have denied it, could have left her identity veiled, but that would rob the moment of its weight. "Yes," she said at last, her voice measured, carrying easily through the cabin. "I am Naomi Ellington, CEO of Ellington Dynamics." The words landed like thunder. Gas spread through first class, a wave of disbelief colliding with recognition. Passengers whispered fiercely now, phones subtly raised to capture the moment. Every person in the cabin knew the name Ellington Dynamics, a global leader in aerospace innovation, medical AI, and sustainable energy. Naomi Ellington wasn't just wealthy. She was one of the most powerful women in America. Charlotte's stomach turned violently. Her vision blurred for a moment as the full horror of what she had done settled into her chest. She hadn't just dismissed an elderly passenger she had humiliated and struck the very woman who had built much of the airline industry's modern infrastructure. Alyssa Grant nearly dropped the teapot she was carrying. She had suspected Naomi was someone important, but to hear the truth left her shaken. Her heart twisted with guilt for staying silent at the gate. Marcus leaned back slowly, eyes wide. Then, everything she said earlier, everything we saw. He trailed off, unable to finish, but the implication was clear. Naomi had been right all along, and Charlotte had been devastatingly wrong. Edward Monroe stood then, his posture commanding. He faced the cabin and spoke with deliberate clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ellington is indeed the founder and CEO of Ellington Dynamics. She is also a longtime partner of this airline. Tonight she was subjected to treatment no passenger should ever endure. What you witnessed will be addressed with the utmost seriousness." The murmurs turned into a heavy silence. The magnitude of the revelation pressed down like gravity. Even those who had merely been bystanders felt complicit in some way, knowing they had watched in silence when dignity was stripped away. Naomi broke the silence herself, her voice calm but resonant. "Let me make one thing clear. I do not expect different treatment because of my title. My presence here tonight is no more valuable than that of any passenger seated on this plane. But what happened to me could just as easily happen to someone without a name you recognize, and that is the true disgrace." Her words struck like arrows, piercing not only Charlotte's defenses, but the consciences of everyone who had witnessed the earlier scene. The truth was undeniable had she been just another elderly black woman with no famous name. Charlotte's arrogance might have gone unchallenged, forgotten within minutes. Charlotte's legs trembled. She stumbled a step forward, nearly colliding with the drink cart. "Dr. Ellington," she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't realize." Naomi's eyes fixed on her, calm but sharp as glass. "That is exactly the problem. Miss Briggs, you didn't realize because you didn't care to. You saw someone who didn't match your vision of belonging, and you acted accordingly." The silence was suffocating now. Even Captain William Hart, stepping into the cabin from the cockpit to observe, felt the weight of Naomi's words. Charlotte felt exposed, stripped of every shield she had ever carried. Her arrogance, her pride, her certainty of superiority, they crumbled like fragile glass in the face of Naomi's quiet truth. Tears stung her eyes, but she bit them back, unwilling to break completely in front of so many witnesses. Naomi did not raise her voice, did not demand retribution. She only turned slightly toward Monroe. "The responsibility now rests with your airline. What you choose to do will tell these passengers whether your values are words or reality." Monroe inclined his head deeply. "You have my word, Dr. Ellington. Accountability will not end with this flight." The passengers seemed to exhale collectively, as though a verdict had been pronounced. Some nodded with approval. Others exchanged glances that spoke of their own unease. Everyone knew they would remember this night. As service resumed awkwardly, Marcus leaned forward again, his tone earnest. "Dr. Ellington, if I may, I saw what happened at the gate. I should have spoken up then. I regret my silence." Naomi regarded him quietly, then offered a small nod. "Regret can be useful," she said softly, "if it becomes resolve." Marcus bowed his head, the lesson settling deep in the galley. Charlotte gripped the counter, her knuckles white. She wanted to run, to hide, but she had nowhere left to go. She had been publicly unmasked, not just for humiliating a CEO, but for exposing the prejudice in her own heart. For the first time in her career, she understood what it meant to be powerless. The rest of the cabin buzzed with low conversation, but beneath it all lay a new current, not of gossip, but of reckoning. People were thinking, comparing, reflecting on their own moments of judgment, their own silences. Naomi lifted her glass of water, taking a slow sip, then set it down gently. Her presence was no longer just dignified, it was transformative. This was no longer about one woman and one flight attendant. It was about everyone on that plane, and the uncomfortable truth that respect should never depend on recognition. The cabin lights had been dimmed to a softer glow, a signal that dinner service was ending. Trays were cleared quietly, the gentle clink of silverware giving way to the steady hum of the engines. Yet the tension in the air hadn't eased. If anything, it had thickened. Every passenger knew the evening wasn't finished. There was still something unresolved, a weight pressing on everyone's chest. Edward Monroe remained at the front of the cabin, arms folded, gaze steady. He had already decided what must come next. Passengers deserved closure, not just whispers of accountability behind closed doors. And Charlotte Briggs, trembling though she was, needed to face the people who had witnessed everything. "Miss Briggs," Monroe said at last, his tone even but commanding. His voice carried through the cabin, silencing conversations instantly. "Step forward." Charlotte froze. The words hit her like a blow. and for a moment her legs refused to move. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, judgment heavy in the dim light. Slowly, painfully, she unclenched her grip on the galley counter and stepped into the aisle. Her posture, once sharp and self-assured, had wilted. She stood awkwardly, hands clasped in front of her, trying to maintain composure while her chest ached with humiliation. Her voice caught in her throat before she finally forced words out. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone wavering, "I owe you an apology." Whispers rippled instantly through the rows. Some leaned forward. Others folded their arms. The spectacle was as rare as it was uncomfortable, a flight attendant addressing first-class passengers, not with instructions, but with contrition. Charlotte's lips trembled. She glanced briefly toward Naomi Ellington, whose expression was calm, unflinching. That look compelled her to continue. "My behavior earlier today was unacceptable," Charlotte said, her words shaky, falling heavier than she anticipated. "I made assumptions about a passenger. I dismissed her, doubted her right to be here, and when she stood her ground, I let my frustration boil over." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I humiliated her in front of all of you?" The silence grew heavier. Every passenger remembered the slap of the boarding pass, the cane clattering on the floor, the sharpness of Charlotte's voice. Hearing her admit it now forced those memories back with startling clarity. Charlotte's eyes stung, but she kept them open, forcing herself to endure the moment. "I told myself I was enforcing rules, that I was protecting standards, but the truth is, I judged her by appearance, by what I thought a first-class passenger should look like. That was wrong, deeply wrong, and I can't undo it." A faint cough sounded from somewhere in the cabin, the only break in the stillness. Charlotte's chest tightened further. This was worse than anger or shouting. This was silence that judged her far more cruelly than words could. "I owe Dr. Ellington my sincerest apology," she continued, her voice trembling now. "And I owe each of you an apology as well. You witnessed something that should never have happened. I disrespected not only her, but the dignity this airline should uphold for everyone on board. My actions failed you all." She paused, forcing in a ragged breath. For the first time, her shoulders slumped. Pride had abandoned her entirely. She felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Naomi's voice came then, soft but resolute. "Miss Briggs." Charlotte turned, eyes wide, bracing for further condemnation. But Naomi's gaze wasn't furious. It was steady, piercing, but strangely calm. "I accept your apology," Naomi said, her tone even. "But remember, what you did to me tonight isn't about me. It's about every passenger who doesn't carry a name you recognize. Would you have stood here admitting fault if I had been just another face in the crowd?" The question hit harder than any reprimand. Charlotte's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence answered for her, and the passengers knew it. Several shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to deny the truth embedded in Naomi's words. Finally, Charlotte whispered, "No, I wouldn't have." A hush swept through the cabin. Some passengers exhaled sharply. Others shook their heads, but no one looked away. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her expression unyielding. "That is the lesson you must carry. Not because I am CEO, but because you cannot measure respect by status. If tonight changes you, then let it be because you recognize the humanity in everyone, not just the powerful." Charlotte's breath caught. For the first time, something inside her cracked not just her pride, but the shield she had built around her own biases. She bowed her head, ashamed, yet strangely grateful for words that carried both truth and the possibility of change. Monroe spoke again, his voice solemn. "Miss Briggs, you will remain in this cabin for the rest of the flight, serving Dr. Ellington directly. That is not a choice, it is a directive. And when we land, you will face further consequences. For now, consider this your opportunity to prove whether your apology carries weight." Charlotte nodded stiffly, though humiliation burned across her skin. "Yes, sir." She turned back toward Naomi, forcing herself to meet her gaze. "If there is anything you require during this flight, Dr. Ellington, please allow me to provide it." Naomi regarded her for a long moment, then inclined her head once. "I'll keep that in mind." And with that, the moment ended, not with applause, not with forgiveness, but with a silence that held its own gravity. Passengers turned slowly back to their seats. Though none would forget what they had just witnessed, Marcus Caldwell leaned back heavily, the weight of Naomi's words echoing in his own chest. Alyssa Grant busied herself with trays, her eyes glistening with emotions she didn't dare show openly. Charlotte retreated to the galley, her movements wooden. Yet something had shifted. The shame still seared, but beneath it lay a faint, unfamiliar spark, the beginning of recognition. For the first time in years, she questioned not just her actions, but herself. Naomi adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, then opened the novel on her tray table. Her serenity returned, but her presence now carried even more power. She had not sought revenge, nor demanded humiliation. She had demanded something harder: truth. And in that truth, every passenger had been forced to confront themselves, even if only for a moment. The cabin settled into a heavy quiet after Charlotte's apology. But it wasn't the calm of resolution. It was the silence of reflection, of unspoken thoughts swirling in every passenger's mind. The lights had dimmed further, casting the cabin in a soft amber glow, but the atmosphere was charged. Naomi Ellington opened her book again, her eyes tracing the lines, though she absorbed little of what she read. She had learned long ago to keep her composure outwardly, but inside she was not untouched. The sting of humiliation lingered like a bruise. But what weighed on her most was the reminder that no amount of success or recognition could shield her from prejudice. It was a truth she had carried all her life, but every reminder cut fresh. Her thoughts slipped unbidden to her late husband, Daniel. He had often warned her that leadership meant loneliness. "You'll sit in rooms where no one looks like you, Naomi," he used to say, "and sometimes you'll be reminded, harshly, that the world still doubts you. But you can't carry their doubt inside yourself." His voice echoed in her memory, steady and warm, and she let it steady her now. Across the aisle, Marcus Caldwell reclined in his seat, staring at the dark screen of the monitor in front of him. He hadn't touched the champagne the attendants offered. His guilt had not faded. It had deepened after Charlotte's apology. She had admitted her prejudice in front of the entire cabin, and though it had shamed her, it also forced Marcus to confront his own failure. He thought of his daughter, Simone, a freshman in college. She had inherited his sharp eyes and his mother's stubbornness. Just last month she had told him bluntly, "Dad, staying quiet makes you part of the problem." At the time, he had brushed it off with a laugh, claiming wisdom meant knowing when to hold your tongue. But tonight, hearing Naomi's calm words, he realized Simone had been right all along. He had been part of the problem, not because he acted, but because he hadn't. Marcus closed his eyes, picturing Simone's face, He imagined telling her what had happened tonight, and he already knew the question she would ask. What did you do? Dad. The answer would burn him. I stayed silent until it was too late. He clenched his jaw. That truth gnawed at him more than Charlotte's arrogance ever could. Meanwhile, Charlotte Briggs moved stiffly through the motions of service, her body obeying muscle memory while her mind churned with turmoil. She refilled Naomi's glass of water, adjusted her blanket, brought her a warm towel. Each task was an exercise in humility, her hands trembling with shame. Her thoughts screamed at her, "You're ruined. Your career is over. They'll strip your uniform the moment this plane lands." Yet beneath the panic was another, quieter voice, one she had long ignored. It whispered that Naomi's words were true, that she had judged without thought, that she had built her confidence on false superiority. Charlotte hated that voice, but she couldn't silence it. For years, she had convinced herself she was fair, professional, above reproach. Now, stripped bare before her peers and passengers, she saw herself differently, and what she saw unsettled her more than the threat of losing her job. In the galley, Alyssa Grant lingered near the coffee pots, pretending to busy herself while her mind wrestled with its own battle. She had admired Naomi Ellington from the moment she recognized her name, but admiration was not enough. She had done nothing at the gate. She had watched silently as humiliation unfolded, her fear of challenging Charlotte stronger than her instinct to defend what was right. Her heart ached with regret. She wanted to approach Naomi, to confess her silence, to promise she would be braver next time. But her legs felt anchored to the floor. Instead, she pressed her palms against the counter and whispered to herself, "Next time? There has to be a next time." Captain William Hart sat quietly in the cockpit, though he, too, felt the weight of the evening. Monroe had briefed him on what had happened before takeoff, but hearing Naomi's revelation in the cabin had shaken him. He had flown for 30 years, prided himself on fairness, on treating every passenger equally. Yet he wondered now if blind spots had crept into his own life, invisible but real. In first class, the hum of the engines became a backdrop for private wars of conscience. Some passengers typed furiously on laptops, drafting posts they might share later. Others simply stared out the window, replaying the boarding scene in their minds. The discomfort was universal, though each carried it differently. Naomi finally set her book aside and closed her eyes. She breathed deeply, centering herself. She knew what was happening around her. She could feel it in the charged stillness. People were wrestling not only with her experience, but with their own. That was good. That was necessary. If her humiliation had to mean something, let it be this, that people began questioning themselves. She thought of her father again, remembering his quiet dignity even when faced with insults that would have broken lesser men. He used to tell her, "You can't control what others think of you, Naomi, but you can control what you reflect back. Make sure what they see in you is stronger than what they throw at you." Her hand brushed against the handle of her cane, and she smiled faintly. Stronger, always stronger. At the back of the cabin, Charlotte poured herself a glass of water and sipped shakily. Her eyes flicked toward Naomi once more. She wanted to approach, to say something beyond the forced apology Monroe had demanded. But fear rooted her in place. What if Naomi dismissed her? What if she didn't believe her sincerity? But another thought pressed harder. What if she never tries? What if this moment passes, and she learns nothing? Charlotte gripped the cup tighter, then set it down with trembling hands. For the first time in years, She wasn't thinking about promotions or schedules or uniforms. She was thinking about herself, the parts she had buried, the truths she had denied. It was terrifying. The cabin remained quiet, but beneath that quiet lay a storm. Everyone on board carried something different, now shame, guilt, reflection, or resolve. And though no words were spoken, Naomi felt it. She sat straighter, shoulders squared, as if bracing not only for the rest of the flight, but for the conversations that would come after landing. Because tonight was no longer just about her. Tonight was about what everyone else would do with the mirror she had held up before them. The cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm, passengers half asleep or lost in their own thoughts. When the unexpected happened, the soft chime of the intercom broke through the hum of the engines. Charlotte Briggs's voice, fragile yet determined, filled the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. I need to address something directly." Heads lifted instantly. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Normally, announcements mid-flight were routine seatbelt reminders, turbulence warnings, but this one carried a weight everyone recognized. Naomi Ellington raised her gaze slowly, her brow narrowing slightly. She hadn't expected Charlotte to speak again, not after the public apology demanded earlier. Even Edward Monroe turned from his seat, frowning, uncertain whether to intervene. Charlotte's voice quivered, but she pressed on. "Earlier tonight, many of you saw my actions toward Dr. Ellington. You saw me treat her with disrespect, and you saw me humiliate someone who deserved nothing but courtesy. I've apologized once, but I realize words said in the aisle are not enough. I cannot undo what I did, but I can admit to everyone on this plane that I was wrong, deeply wrong." The cabin was still, hushed but electric. Even the usual hum of private conversation ceased. Charlotte's throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to tell you something personal. The truth is, I grew up believing respect was earned only by appearance, by polish, by fitting an image. Somewhere along the way, I carried that belief into this uniform. Tonight, Dr. Ellington exposed the ugliness of that thinking. She reminded me that respect should never depend on recognition or status. It should be given freely, because every person has worth." A murmur spread through the rows, some passengers nodding faintly. Others simply stared, moved despite themselves. Charlotte's next words faltered as her chest clenched. "I was wrong. And to anyone who has ever been dismissed by someone like me, I'm sorry. To Dr. Ellington, I'm sorry. And I promise, if I am given the chance to continue in this role, I will not be the same person you saw at that gate." She lowered the handset slowly, her heart racing. For a moment, silence reigned again. Then, unexpectedly, a soft clap echoed from the back of first class. One passenger, then another. The applause was hesitant, uneven, but it grew until half the cabin joined in. It wasn't loud, not triumphant, but it was enough. Charlotte blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill. She hadn't expected applause. She hadn't expected anything but judgment. Naomi sat unmoved, though her eyes softened slightly. She did not clap. This wasn't her moment, but she acknowledged Charlotte with a slow, deliberate nod. For Charlotte, it was more powerful than applause. But just as the tension seemed to ease, turbulence rocked the plane suddenly. Drinks rattled, silverware clinked in the galleys, and passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign dinged sharply overhead. Captain William Hart's calm voice broke in over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit an unexpected air pocket, Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. We'll be adjusting altitude." The cabin shifted uneasily. Flight attendants moved quickly to secure carts. Charlotte steadied herself against the wall, her adrenaline already high, now spiking with the jolt. Naomi placed her hand lightly on her cane, grounding herself as the plane dipped again. She had flown countless times, but turbulence always carried a primal reminder of fragility. Still, her face remained calm, unshaken. As the turbulence settled, Marcus Caldwell leaned toward Naomi, his voice low. "It's strange, isn't it? A few jolts, and suddenly everyone realizes how small we are." Naomi glanced at him, reading the deeper meaning in his words. He wasn't just talking about the plane. He was talking about himself, about silence, about cowardice, about the smallness he had felt when he failed to act. "Smallness isn't weakness," Naomi replied gently. "It's a reminder. What matters is what we choose to do when the shaking stops." Marcus absorbed her words, his chest tightening with both shame and hope. Meanwhile, in the galley, Alyssa clutched the counter, breathing hard. She had felt every bump in her bones, but more than the turbulence, it was Charlotte's announcement that rattled her. She had watched her colleague strip herself bare in front of passengers, admitting things Alyssa herself had never dared say aloud. And though she had judged Charlotte's arrogance harshly earlier, she now felt something else, a stirring of respect. Not for who Charlotte had been, but for the risk she had just taken. Edward Monroe moved toward the front of the cabin once the turbulence passed, his expression composed. He leaned near Naomi and said quietly, "That was not part of my directive." Naomi's lips curved faintly. "No, that was part of hers." Monroe studied Charlotte, who stood rigid, flushed from the effort of her confession. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. Perhaps there was something salvageable after all. As calm returned to the cabin, passengers settled back again. Some whispered about Charlotte's words. Others simply closed their eyes, reflecting. But the mood had shifted. The tension hadn't dissolved completely, but it had bent into something different, a quiet acknowledgement that change, however small, had begun. Naomi leaned back, letting her eyes drift closed. For the first time that night, she felt a subtle sense of release. The sting of humiliation still lingered, but Charlotte's words, however imperfect, had turned the mirror outward. Passengers weren't only looking at Naomi anymore, they were looking at themselves. And in that silence, Naomi found the faintest thread of peace. The cabin had grown quiet again after Charlotte's intercom announcement, but this silence was different. It wasn't heavy with judgment anymore. It was contemplative, softened by the vulnerability passengers had just witnessed. A few people returned to their screens, others adjusted pillows, but eyes still lingered occasionally on Naomi Ellington and the woman who had wronged her. Naomi sat with her hands folded, the edges of her book resting in her lap. She hadn't read a single word in the last half hour. Instead, she listened to the subtle shifts in breathing, to the quiet coughs, to the rhythm of the engines carrying them west. She knew the storm inside Charlotte Briggs wasn't over. The apology had opened a wound, but wounds didn't heal without care. Finally, she lifted her gaze toward the galley. Charlotte stood there, hands clasped, shoulders tense, glancing toward her every so often, but never daring to approach. Naomi sighed softly, then spoke just loud enough to carry across the aisle. "Miss Briggs," she said. Charlotte startled, as if her name were a summons from the depths of her conscience. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she stepped forward until she stood beside Naomi's seat. "Yes, Dr. Ellington." Her voice was hushed, uncertain. Naomi studied her for a long moment, then gestured lightly to the empty seat across the aisle. Sit. Charlotte hesitated. Passengers nearby turned subtly, pretending not to listen though their ears strained for every word. Monroe watched intently from a few rows back, prepared to intervene if needed. Finally, Charlotte obeyed, lowering herself into the seat across from Naomi. Her posture was stiff, as if the leather burned beneath her. Naomi leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but steady. Tell me something. Why do you think you reacted the way you did at the gate? Charlotte's lips parted, but no easy answer came. She stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap. I thought I was doing my job, protecting the standards of first class. That's what I told myself. Naomi's eyes sharpened. And what did you truly believe? Charlotte's throat tightened. Her face flushed. That you didn't belong? The words scraped her throat like glass. Because you didn't look like the others. Because you walked with a cane. Because, she faltered, tears brimming. Because I saw what I wanted to see, not who you really were. Naomi let the confession hang in the air. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads. Marcus Caldwell closed his eyes briefly, recognizing his own complicity in silence. Naomi's voice softened, but carried weight. The danger isn't only in cruelty. Miss Briggs, it's in blindness. When you look at someone and decide they don't belong before you know their story, you rob them of dignity and you rob yourself of the truth. Charlotte swallowed hard, her tears spilling freely now. I know, and I hate myself for it. Naomi shook her head gently. Hating yourself won't change the world. Facing yourself might. For a long moment, Charlotte simply sat there, trembling under the weight of Naomi's gaze. Then, in a voice so quiet it nearly broke, she whispered, How do I begin to change? Naomi leaned back slightly, her hands resting again on her cane. By listening, by remembering this moment every time you're tempted to judge, by choosing each day to see people as more than your assumptions. Charlotte nodded slowly, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. It was then that Alyssa Grant stepped hesitantly into the aisle. She had hovered in the galley long enough, listening to every word, her own guilt gnawing at her. She clasped her hands nervously, but her voice trembled as she spoke. Dr. Ellington, she began. I need to say something, too. Naomi turned toward her, expression patient. Go on. Alyssa's eyes glistened. I saw everything at the gate. I wanted to step in, but I didn't. I froze. I told myself it wasn't my place, that Charlotte was senior and I should stay quiet. But the truth is, I was scared, and because of that, I let you stand alone. Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. I'm sorry. I failed you. I failed everyone. Naomi regarded her carefully. You failed yourself most of all, she said, her tone firm but not unkind. But courage is like a muscle. Miss Grant, it grows only if you use it. Tonight you were silent. Tomorrow you must not be. Alyssa nodded quickly, tears streaking down her cheeks. I won't. Not again. I promise. The exchange rippled through the cabin, leaving passengers deeply moved. Some lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet Naomi's gaze, lest their own guilt show. Others leaned forward slightly, their expressions softened, almost reverent. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Listening to Charlotte and Alyssa confess so openly made his own silence weigh even heavier. He wanted to speak, to admit his failure to Naomi directly, but shame held him back. Instead, he scribbled in his notebook again, words trembling across the page. Speak when silence is easier. Defend when it costs something. Naomi, sensing the collective stillness, spoke louder now. Her words meant not only for Charlotte and Alyssa, but for every ear within reach. Every one of us, she said, faces a choice when we see someone treated unjustly. We can look away, or we can step forward. Tonight, many chose silence. I don't say that to condemn you. I say it because silence is what allows injustice to breathe. The cabin was utterly still. Even the hum of the engines seemed muted beneath her voice. When you leave this plane, she continued, you may forget the meal you ate, the movie you watched, even the turbulence we faced. But I hope you will not forget this respect is not optional. It is not earned by titles or wealth. It is owed to every human being. Her words sank deep, leaving passengers visibly moved. Some dabbed at their eyes. Others sat with shoulders hunched, burdened by the truth, but strangely grateful for it. Charlotte whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Naomi held her gaze, steady but calm. "Don't thank me. Show me. Show yourself. That will be thanks enough." For the first time all night, Charlotte allowed herself a small, trembling smile. Alyssa stood silently beside her, nodding with determination through her tears. She knew Naomi was right. Courage had to be practiced. And she silently vowed she would not be silent next time. The cabin slowly exhaled. The weight of the night hadn't vanished. But something in it had shifted. The sting of humiliation had transformed into a lesson, one carried not just by Charlotte and Alyssa, but by everyone who had listened. Naomi closed her eyes once more, leaning back in her seat. She was tired now, bone-tired, but for the first time since the gate, her heart felt lighter. Perhaps tonight's wound had already begun to heal, not just for her, but for others. The descent began just before dawn. The soft glow of the rising sun seeped through the oval windows, painting streaks of pale gold across the cabin. Passengers stirred, fastening seat belts, adjusting blankets, closing laptops. The mood was quieter than usual, subdued not by sleep, but by the memory of everything that had unfolded during the flight. Naomi Ellington gazed out the window, the faint skyline of San Francisco breaking through wisps of morning fog. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, almost serene. Yet beneath that stillness, her mind was already turning toward what awaited on the ground. She knew the story wouldn't end when the wheels touched the runway. In many ways, it was just beginning. Charlotte Briggs moved slowly through the cabin, collecting stray cups and offering last-minute checks. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced with humility that made her posture smaller, her movements quieter. Every passenger who looked at her now saw not the authoritative attendant they had met hours earlier, but someone stripped raw by accountability. Some greeted her with nods of acknowledgement, others with cold avoidance, but all carried the memory of her earlier actions. Alyssa Grant worked beside her, her hands steadier than before. She had cried quietly in the galley after her conversation with Naomi, but now she carried herself with a newfound determination. She smiled gently at passengers, though her mind repeated Naomi's words like a mantra. Silence allows injustice to breathe. Marcus Caldwell sat with his notebook open in his lap, pen tapping against the page. His notes had grown over the night-scribbled phrases, fragmented promises, arrows pointing to words like speak, risk, courage. He knew he had to do more than write. He had to act. And though the thought terrified him, he found comfort in the idea that perhaps everyone on this flight had been given the same challenge. The landing gear thudded into place, jolting the cabin slightly. Captain William Hart's voice filled the speakers, calm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final approach into San Francisco International Airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are upright. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us." The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone. Thank you for flying with us. Few passengers would leave this plane with a simple sense of gratitude. They would leave carrying a story, one that would echo far beyond this cabin. As the plane touched down, the wheels screeching against the tarmac, Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She whispered to herself, so softly no one else could hear, "Stand, like the oak." The aircraft slowed, taxied, and finally came to rest at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and immediately the cabin filled with the rustle of movement. Overhead bins creaked open, luggage thumped, phones chimed to life. But there was no rush, no impatient crowding of the aisle. Everyone seemed to sense that something was about to unfold, and they waited, hesitant, almost reverent. Edward Monroe rose first, his presence commanding as he stepped into the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "before we disembark, I need to make something clear." The cabin fell silent once more. Even the passengers in economy, overhearing through parted curtains, quieted. "What you witnessed tonight will not vanish into paperwork," Monroe continued. "Our airline has a duty not just to Dr. Ellington, not just to our shareholders, but to every passenger who boards our planes. Accountability begins here. Consequences will follow." A murmur rippled, some nodding, others whispering. Monroe turned toward Naomi, his expression softening. "Dr. Ellington, if you would allow, we have a team waiting at the gate to ensure your comfort and to escort you through." Naomi shook her head gently. "I don't need an escort. I need to walk through that gate as any passenger would. That is the point." Monroe bowed his head in respect. "As you wish." Charlotte stood rooted to the floor near the galley, her heart hammering. She dreaded the moment of disembarkation, knowing each passenger would pass her, knowing each glance would cut deeper than any words. But she also knew she couldn't run. Naomi's voice from earlier echoed in her chest. "Don't thank me. Show me." The aisle cleared row by row, until at last Naomi rose from seat 1A. She reached for her cane, stood gracefully, and moved toward the door. Her presence alone parted the line, passengers stepping back slightly, allowing her to pass with dignity. Some nodded respectfully, others murmured words of support, but Naomi simply inclined her head, her expression serene. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool morning air brushed against her face. Reporters weren't there yet, nor cameras. Monroe had made sure of that. But she knew the story would spread regardless. Dozens of witnesses carried it now, and in the age of smartphones, silence was no longer possible. Behind her, Charlotte faced the hardest part. One by one, passengers filed past her, some ignoring her entirely, others pausing just long enough to give her looks that spoke volumes: disappointment, pity, judgment. Each one felt like a stone, added to the weight she already carried. Then Marcus paused before her. He looked her straight in the eye, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Charlotte braced for condemnation. "Instead," Marcus said quietly, "learn from it. Don't waste it." Then he stepped past, leaving her stunned. Alyssa followed, her eyes softer. She touched Charlotte's arm gently, whispering, "We'll do better. Together." Charlotte blinked, her throat tightening. She nodded once, unable to form words. When the last passenger had disembarked, Monroe turned to Charlotte. "You will report directly to headquarters. A disciplinary panel awaits. Whatever happens next depends on your willingness to prove you are not the same person who stood at that gate." Charlotte lowered her head. "I understand." Naomi, walking through the terminal, adjusted her scarf and inhaled deeply. The day ahead would be filled with meetings, with apologies, with the machinery of corporate response, but in her heart she carried a different mission. Tonight had not been about punishment. It had been about awakening, and as she moved toward the exit, cane tapping softly against the floor, she allowed herself a quiet smile. The oak did not shout. It stood, and sometimes, in standing, it made others rise as well. By the time Naomi Ellington arrived at the airline's headquarters later that afternoon, the storm had already broken. News outlets had seized the story, fueled by passenger accounts and blurry smartphone footage from the gate. The headline dominated every feed: "Flight attendant slaps passenger not knowing." She was the airline CEO. The irony alone was irresistible. Naomi walked into the glass-paneled boardroom with the steady rhythm of her cane, unhurried, unbowed. The long mahogany table was surrounded by executives, their faces taut with unease. Edward Monroe stood near the head, his jaw set, eyes sharp. His greeting was simple. "Dr. Ellington, thank you for coming." "Thank you for making the time," Naomi replied, lowering herself into a chair. She didn't need to assert power. The silence that followed spoke loudly enough. James Whitford, Chief of Operations, cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Ellington, first let me say on behalf of the board, we deeply regret what happened to you." It was unacceptable. Naomi raised her hand, halting him with gentle authority. "This is not about me. If you believe this begins and ends with my experience, then you've already missed the lesson." A heavy pause fell across the table. Monroe nodded faintly, inviting her to continue. Naomi's voice was calm but deliberate. "Charlotte Briggs humiliated me publicly because she assumed I did not belong in first class. But the truth is, she could have done the same to anyone who didn't fit her narrow idea of worth. And if you think she's an isolated case, you are wrong. The culture you've allowed to flourish gave her permission to act that way." A murmur rippled among the executives, some shifting uncomfortably. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about one slap, one mistake. It's about every quiet moment of bias, every dismissal, every assumption that chips away at dignity. If you want to fix this, you can't scapegoat Charlotte and move on. You must confront the system that shaped her." For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the overhead lights. Then Monroe spoke, his tone low and grave. "Dr. Ellington, what would you have us do?" Naomi held his gaze. "Begin with truth. Commission an independent audit of passenger complaints. Review crew training from the ground up, and do not bury the findings. Make them public. If you want trust, earn it." The board members exchanged anxious glances. The idea of exposing internal failings made their skin crawl, but they knew she was right. The reputation of the airline had already taken a hit. Concealment would only dig the grave deeper. Monroe nodded slowly. "It will be done." Naomi wasn't finished. "And one more thing. You cannot demand respect from employees who feel unseen themselves. Support them. Teach them what it means to serve with dignity, not by fear of punishment, but by conviction. If they cannot learn, let them go, but give them the chance first." The words settled heavily, yet they carried an unexpected clarity. For the first time, The executive saw not a victim demanding justice, but a leader mapping transformation. Charlotte Briggs entered the room then, escorted by HR. She looked smaller than Naomi had ever seen her, her crisp uniform wrinkled, her face pale. She sat at the far end of the table, eyes fixed on her trembling hands. James Whitford began the formal proceedings. Miss Briggs, this hearing is to determine the consequences of your actions. You may speak in your defense. Charlotte lifted her head slowly, her voice breaking. There is no defense. I humiliated Dr. Ellington. I embarrassed this airline. I acted out of arrogance and bias. I deserve to lose my job. Her admission was raw, unvarnished. For once, she didn't try to control the room. Naomi studied her for a long moment before speaking. Miss Briggs, what do you believe you owe the passengers who watched Charlotte's lips parted, then closed again? Her eyes brimmed with tears. I owe them honesty. I owe them change. I can't erase what I did, but I can be the proof that people like me can learn. The room was still. Naomi saw sincerity in her eyes, not perfection, not certainty, but sincerity. Naomi turned back to the board. This is your choice. Fire her, and you will send a message about punishment. Keep her under strict probation, and you will send a message about transformation. Which is the greater lesson for the world to see? The debate that followed was tense. Some executives argued termination was the only way to protect the airline's image. Others, emboldened by Naomi's words, leaned toward probation. In the end, Monroe cast the deciding vote. Charlotte Briggs, he said firmly, you will remain employed, but under the most stringent probation in company history. 6 months of retraining, mentorship, and public accountability. One misstep, and your employment ends immediately. This is not leniency. This is a final chance to prove you can be better. Charlotte bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, though she knew gratitude was not enough. Naomi stood, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. Remember, this punishment satisfies anger. Transformation serves justice. Choose justice. As she left the boardroom, reporters swarmed the building's lobby. Microphones flashed. Cameras surged forward. Dr. Ellington, do you feel justice was served? One shouted. Naomi paused, her calm eyes meeting the chaos. Justice is not a headline. It's what happens when we decide to learn from pain instead of bearing it. Today, this airline chose to learn. Time will prove whether that choice holds. The clip would replay across news stations for days. Her words shared in articles and social media posts. But for Naomi, it was not about virality. It was about planting seeds that might outlive her voice. In the following weeks, the airline announced sweeping reforms. Passenger complaint systems were overhauled. New training programs centered on empathy and anti-bias education. And most shocking of all, the internal audit Naomi demanded was published openly, revealing years of ignored grievances. The public reaction was fierce, but something remarkable happened instead of collapsing under the scrutiny. The airline began to rebuild credibility. Passengers returned, not because the airline was perfect, but because it had admitted it wasn't. Naomi watched from a quiet distance, continuing her own work. She never sought credit. She simply believed in standing, like the oak, steady enough to cast shade for others. Marcus Caldwell reached out weeks later, sending her a letter. He had spoken up during a board meeting at his firm, confronting dismissive comments that once he would have ignored. Your words gave me courage, he wrote. For the first time, I didn't stay silent. Alyssa, too, wrote. confessing she had volunteered to lead a new employee resource group focused on accountability and respect. "I don't want to be silent anymore." Her message read, "Even Charlotte sent a note, humble and unadorned. I don't ask forgiveness. Only that one day my actions might speak louder than my mistake." Naomi folded each letter carefully, storing them in a small wooden box by her desk. They weren't trophies. They were reminders that standing firm, even in pain, could ripple outward. And though she knew bias would not vanish overnight, she also knew the story of one slap had already become something larger, a lesson in what happens when dignity confronts arrogance, when truth refuses to bow, and when justice chooses the harder road of transformation. Months later, the story of Flight 227 still echoed across news cycles, though its shape had shifted. What began as a scandal had become a touchstone for conversations about dignity, bias, and accountability. Naomi Ellington never sought to be the face of it, yet her presence lingered in every retelling. One crisp autumn morning in San Francisco, Naomi sat on a park bench overlooking the bay, her cane resting beside her, a notebook in her lap. The air was cool, filled with the scent of salt and eucalyptus drifting from nearby groves. She had just finished a lecture at Stanford on leadership and resilience, and the quiet felt like a gift. She flipped through her notebook, where she had copied a few lines from the letters she'd received after the incident. Marcus Caldwell's words stood out. For the first time. I didn't stay silent. Alyssa Grant's promise. I don't want to be silent anymore. Even Charlotte Briggs's humble admission. One day my actions might speak louder than my mistake. Naomi traced the ink with her finger. These were not just words. They were seeds. And though she might never see them grow into full trees, she trusted they would take root. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was an email notification from Marcus. Curious. She opened it. Dr. Ellington. It read, I thought you should know. Today, our firm passed a new policy to protect employees from subtle bias in promotion reviews. It's not perfect, but it's a start. I told them about you, about the flight, about the oak. Thank you for teaching me that silence is not neutral. Naomi smiled softly, folding the phone shut. She leaned back against the bench, watching the water ripple under the morning light. Meanwhile, across the country, Alyssa Grant stood nervously at a podium in a training room filled with new recruits. She had been invited to speak about accountability, something she never imagined she'd be asked to do. Her hands trembled, but when she looked into the faces of those listening, she remembered Naomi's words. Courage is a muscle. Taking a deep breath, she began. I wasn't brave that night. I let silence speak for me. But silence is a choice, and it's one I will never make again. I hope none of you will either. Her voice steadied as she spoke. And when she finished, the applause was real. For the first time, Alyssa felt the weight of her failure transform into the power of her testimony. Charlotte Briggs's journey was harder. Probation was grueling hours of retraining, uncomfortable workshops, humiliating reviews of her behavior. Some colleagues treated her with disdain, others with pity. But Charlotte forced herself to stay, to endure, to learn. Each day she confronted her own reflection, and slowly, painfully, she began to see not the uniform, not the mask of authority, but the person she could become if she chose humility. 6 months after the incident, she wrote Naomi another letter. Dr. Ellington, she wrote, I don't know if you believe in second chances, but I want you to know I've spent every day trying to be worthy of the one you gave me. I no longer measure passengers by appearance. I listen to their stories. I've even started volunteering on weekends, helping at a shelter where no one wears suits or carries titles. I don't ask for your forgiveness, only that my actions now honor the chance you insisted I deserved." Naomi received the letter late one evening. She sat at her desk, reading it slowly, twice, then 3 times. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a quiet warmth in her chest, like the steady glow of a lantern on a long road. The airline itself transformed in ways few thought possible. Its public audit, though painful, sparked a wave of reforms across the industry. Other companies followed suit, wary of being caught unprepared in the age of viral accountability. Training programs shifted from check-the-box compliance to deeper cultural re-education. Passengers notice, too. Slowly, the airline regained not only its reputation, but something rarer, trust. At a conference months later, a reporter asked Naomi, "Do you think justice was finally served?" Naomi paused, her gaze steady, then replied, "Justice isn't a destination, it's a direction. That night showed us where we were. These changes show us where we can go. As long as we keep walking, there's hope." Her words traveled far, quoted in headlines, repeated in classrooms, echoed in conversations. They weren't just about airlines anymore. They were about workplaces, schools, communities, about the quiet biases that shaped everyday life, and the courage it took to confront them. On another quiet evening, Naomi returned to the oak tree she often visited in Golden Gate Park. It was tall, sprawling, its branches heavy with leaves that whispered in the breeze. She pressed her hand against its bark, rough but grounding. Her father's voice echoed again in her memory. "Stand, like the oak." And she knew now that standing didn't always mean resisting. Sometimes it meant being rooted enough to offer shelter, strong enough to endure storms, patient enough to wait for others to grow. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and violet, Naomi whispered softly, "We're still standing, Dad, and maybe, just maybe, the world is learning to stand with us." For those who had been on Flight 227, the memory never faded. For Marcus, it became a compass for his leadership. For Alyssa, a vow for her career. For Charlotte, a painful but redemptive turning point. For the airline, a chance to redefine what service meant. And for Naomi Ellington, it was a reminder that even in humiliation, even in pain, there was the power to plant seeds. Seeds of change, seeds of healing, seeds that, one day, might grow into a forest of oaks. The story of Naomi Ellington reminds us that dignity is not something we earn through titles or wealth. It is something every person deserves. Prejudice often hides in everyday moments a dismissive glance, a silent bystander, an assumption that someone does not belong. For older generations who have seen the world change, this story is a reminder that some lessons must still be learned. Again and again, Naomi could have chosen revenge. She could have destroyed careers with a single word. Instead, she chose accountability and transformation. That choice is not easy. It requires strength, patience, and wisdom. But it is the choice that builds a better tomorrow. The lesson here is simple, but profound when we witness injustice. Silence is not neutral. Our actions or our inaction shape the world around us. And sometimes, the greatest power we have is not to punish, but to help others grow. For anyone listening, especially those who have felt judged or dismissed, take heart like the oak Naomi spoke of. We can stand firm, and in standing, we give others the courage to stand, too. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this matter because they remind us of who we are and who we can become. If this touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of dignity, justice, and hope to life.